Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the experiences of people from different ethnic backgrounds in their quest to gain a sense of belonging. And this week, it's a real privilege and pleasure that I've got Pei Lai with us, Pei Lai with us. And Pei Lai is a research associate in academic obstetrics at Imperial College. And Pei, it's really good to have you. And I just wanted to say a big thank you for joining us and ask that question, which I always ask. What was it about when you were growing up which gave you that sense of identity, sense of belonging as a young person?
Firstly, thank you for having me, Wayne. It's always good to watch Belonging, so it's a bit weird to be on the other side. My memory from younger of belonging. My earliest memory is probably back in primary school reception days, where I was literally the only Chinese kid in the entire school, running from reception age all the way to year 5. I stop at year 5 because at year 6 we had one new Chinese kid in the school, and then there were 2, and then when I left, back down to 1. But yeah, so that was my earliest memory of exploring the sense of belonging. And looking back on it, I would say that it was quite mentally isolating being in that situation where I was the only Chinese kid, and I was always that kid that would sort of bounce between friends groups. I never really had a solid friend group to go to. And it was, yeah, it felt very isolating. That's the word that I would go for.
So in terms of at home, because I suppose at school it's isolating being the only one. How did your parents help you to come to terms with being the only one? Did you mention it to them? Did they see it as a problem, or did they give you any kind of like hints, tips as to how to navigate the space, as it were?
Not really. I don't think they kind of understood it in a way, because they were first generation immigrants, right? So they came over here in their 20s coming for a job. Otherwise, when they were educated back in Hong Kong when they weren't the minority, So I think it was probably quite difficult. I mean, they saw it and it's visually obvious, but I don't think they quite understood how it actually felt in a way in the school environment, at least. So yeah, I think at the time as a kid, because you're not very aware of this sort and you're just being a kid, it wasn't so impactful. It's just when I look back on it, it was like, oh yeah, it was quite a lonely environment to be in. But I think when I moved on to secondary school, it wasn't so bad. Even though I was still kind of the only Chinese person. And I think it was because of the general environment, the general approach to me being the only one. Like in primary school, they didn't really make that much of an effort to try and address that. But in secondary school, I felt like they did.
Okay, we'll come on to secondary school in a minute. You've got siblings as well.
Yes.
Did they experience anything similar, or did you discuss it? Did they give you any hints and tips?
They experienced exactly the same thing. I mean, we were in an area of Birmingham where we're literally the only Chinese family in the entire neighborhood, essentially. And they went to the same primary school, actually. So even there's quite a big age gap. So me and my sister, there's a 12-year age gap, and between me and my brother, there's a 15-year age gap. But we kind of experienced the same kind of thing, almost going to the same primary school. Although they kind of had each other, because there was only a 3-year gap between them. So at some point they were together in the primary school. So I guess that helped them. But I think it was just a sense of, you didn't really make much of a big deal about it. You just got on with it and did your best to fit in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you say that when you moved on to secondary school, the school were kind of like helped to cater for the fact that you were the only one. How did they do that? What kind of things would you say that they put in place to help you?
Yeah, so I felt secondary school now, again, in reflection, they were a bit more conscious of it and they were more concerned about it. So I remember in year 7, they did little things like they were, so moving from primary school to secondary school, there were slightly more Chinese people. There were no more than 6 at any given year, but
Mhm.
still better than the only
Yeah.
one across 5 year groups, right? So I think the teaching faculty were very good in sort of being aware that I was the only one and not wanting me to be isolated, because I think they felt that that would put me in a very vulnerable position. And so
Mhm.
in year 7, they made sure that the older Chinese kids would keep an eye out for me. So I remember one of the older kids would come over and be like, "Oh, we just want to check on you, make sure you're okay, make sure you're fitting in okay."
Yeah.
And then I think they did that for almost all the students as well. This is a secondary school that, although it was identified as like one of the lowest performing schools, it was also a school that had a above national average population, I think, minorities in the schools, predominantly Black students and South Asian students, but still a high representation of ethnic minorities. So the teachers are very conscious of, of this, and knowing that they had to teach these kids to be able to get a sense of belonging and get a sense of community and, feel empowered, because they know once they get out of that school environment, it's going to be very different potentially. So one of the things they did in year 7, which was a routine thing for them, was at the end of year 7, they would always have this 1 week residential trip to
Yeah.
Stratford upon Avon. The education in the Midlands, you got Shakespeare at your doorstep. There's bound to be some kind of school trip to Stratford upon Avon to learn about Shakespeare. So that was a really good opportunity for us to bond. And it was that week where I found my friend group,
Right.
from staying away from home, living away from home for a week with just your classmates, sharing bunk beds in a hostel, and just really bonding without your parents for a week, and, having breakfast, dinner and everything with them. And that's when we formed our friends groups. And that was, the teachers knew this was effective at
Yeah.
forming those friend groups in year 7 that was sort of, in most cases, last you to the rest of your school years.
Yeah. So that sounds brilliant. So it was at that point, sorry, bit of traffic here, right? It was at that point that you were able to, is that where would you say that that's where you got a bit more of a sense of belonging, a sense of identity of who you were?
100%. And I think the teachers knew that, and that
Mhm.
that was something that they put in place to make sure that everybody got a sense of belonging within the school environment, and everybody knew they had friends.
That
Yeah.
that's really good to know. I'm just looking at the fact that you've got the background with the Happy New Year. So I know it's the Lunar New Year this weekend, and there's going to be lots of celebrations. In terms of the fact that you said earlier on that your family were the only kind of like Chinese family in the neighborhood, did you have extended family or anything like that, or an extended community where you could get a sense of identity and belonging within at the same time?
Very early on, there wasn't very much of a Chinese community in Birmingham as a city.
Mhm.
We moved into the city before there was what we call the Chinese Quarter, or Chinatown. Essentially, it's Birmingham version of Chinatown. That sort of got built and developed during my lifetime. So over a few years, it became increasingly good for my parents, especially, for more and more Chinese families to move into the city. And then now we just have this really nice, bustling Chinese community. So over a course of several years, it built up to, yeah, we got a sense of belonging. We got a sense of, oh yeah, there's other Chinese people we can go to, and we felt less isolated in that sense culturally. So yeah, outside of the school environment, absolutely, there was a place that eventually, over time, we could go to. Wayne, I've lost your audio.
Sorry, that was my bad. There was so much noise in the background. I'd put myself on mute so it wasn't disturbing you. Sorry.
That's all right.
Now I was just going to ask the question about a little bit more about your educational journey in terms of how it was for you in the school growing up, how you felt you fitted in academically, and how that's helped you to become or to pursue your interest that you're doing now. Why STEM subjects? What was that about?
STEM subjects I always had an interest in. I think in primary school was that subject where you got to play, so it was fun.
Yeah.
You know, you got to ask questions. I always used to be the one who used to irritate my mom because I used to ask so many questions. And science was that one subject where you were allowed to ask loads of questions, and if anything, you were encouraged to,
Yeah.
and you just got to play. And then my brother was into STEM. He did either a bachelor's or master's degree in chemistry. I can't remember which one. So he was very encouraging and like teaching me science at home. So I remember I used to have this blue hardback science encyclopedia that bought me that I absolutely loved because he had like really good illustrations in it. And then he would always used to take me to the science museum. Primary school as well, they also used to always take us to a science museum. Birmingham I was really lucky to be in Birmingham in the sense that we had a very good science museum.
Yeah.
And that was predominantly, I think, because Birmingham is, you know, where the Industrial Revolution started. So
Yeah.
the Science Museum was key to teaching us that.
Yeah.
And I used to love going to that Science Museum. And so there was that general interest and playfulness to science that I latched on to primary school. And then moving into secondary school in terms of studying it more seriously at GCSE level, I think I just was very lucky to have a really good science teacher. Who, you know, to this day, I still remember the lesson where he drew the structure of the cell and taught us all the organelles of the cell. And he was just a brilliant teacher, and he was so dedicated. And, you know, he just taught it very, very well. And, you know, all the teachers were great, but for some reason, the way he taught science just really worked for me and and the way that I learned.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it really helped to have that really good teacher there.
So I suppose the other question that I have is, you said that the school wasn't kind of like renowned or known for having like higher educational achievements as such, but yet you progressed and did quite well, very well actually, and was it always your ambition like to go to university? Was that something which was set, or were your parents pushing you towards that? What were your influences towards academic education, as it were?
I think it was just normalized by my siblings. I just, you know, in terms of figuring out what you're going to do in your life, I just had two older siblings, and you know, they went through the journey of school, college, university. So I thought, okay, I'll just do the same because yeah, that seems like a path. It's an organized path. There's ways to get through it, you know. So that's what I did. My parents, obviously being younger, I probably didn't really appreciate this very much, but you know, they came over. Neither of my parents have university degrees.
Right.
They have basic education. Came over here to work and you know, earn a living and essentially give their kids a chance to get a university education. And so they normalized it, and it was very much, you know, you're going to go to school to get a degree so that you can get a good job. So yeah, it was just a matter of it being normalized and just being part of the routine of growing up.
So for you, it was kind of like, it wasn't forced on you,
No,
but it was, this is what we do. This is what happens.
this is what's going to happen.
Yeah. And having seen your brother and your sister as prime examples, it was natural for you to just continue on.
Yeah.
Much, okay. So what was it that got you interested in the field of study that you're currently doing? Oh, before we go there, let me ask about your university experience, because I'm based on what you've said. You said that during your primary school you were the only one. When you got to secondary school there was a few. What was it like then when you got to university?
Yeah, university was different. I suddenly walked into an environment where I was from being the only Chinese kid and, you know, being one of no more than 6 to going to college being no more than maybe a dozen, to suddenly being in an environment where there's loads of Chinese students.
Yeah.
But they were all Chinese students that were international students. I
Right.
don't recall there being very many British Chinese or even any kind of British East Asian, Southeast Asian in my cohort, at least,
Yeah.
which was in the biosciences building.
Right.
So that was nice in a way on a very superficial level. Okay, I'm surrounded by loads of Chinese people, but how I approached university was that I stayed living at home, so I didn't stay in student accommodation. So the only time I saw these international students was either in the lecture hall, in the lab, in the teaching labs, or in the library. And
Right.
so I didn't really get much of a chance to interact with them very much, except in those learning settings. So I didn't really get much time to socialize with them because it was very much, I treated university almost like treating like how I treat college. You
Yeah.
know, I turned up, I learned my lesson, I went home, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and I also felt a sense of the fact that I felt that I was seen as foreign to these international students because I'm British. So I didn't tend to hang out with them. I tended to hang out with all my British friends, essentially.
Yeah.
And so I think I felt like I was perceived as foreign to them, and I didn't feel particularly comfortable going to them and jumping into their friend group, especially when they came in such large numbers, right? It's like anything, you turn up with an entourage. It's very hard for people who didn't turn up with you.
With you too.
Yeah, it's exactly, walk into this entourage. So yeah, although in theory, I think in my mom's head, sending her kids to university, one of the things about it is, oh yeah, we will meet other Chinese people, and then, you know, and yes, there is, but that doesn't necessarily automatically mean there will be a bond there.
Yeah.
And I think I realized that at university very quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a real, I find that really quite interesting in terms of I know that when I've spoken to other people, it's that kind of like, you view China or Hong Kong as like home because that's where your parents have, it's their frame of reference, but your frame of reference is kind of like in the UK.
Yeah.
Am I? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's that nostalgic approach, but the reality sometimes doesn't live up to the nostalgia of what it should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. For my parents anyway. I mean, you want to bond with that culture out of respect for your parents.
Yeah.
But then you kind of have to acknowledge you were raised differently, and there are going to be differences, and you can't just bond simply on the basis that you look the same, and you know, your heritage is from the same homeland, essentially.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was.
How did you find it challenging at times? The fact that you had these other Chinese students, but yet you didn't seem to necessarily have that connection, as it were. Am I right to say that?
Challenging. I don't know. It didn't really bother me at the time.
Right. Okay.
I think looking back on it now, I feel like, oh, maybe I should have been a bit more effort. I think there's also the good thing of being in academia as well. I kind of compensated for that by working academia because it's still an environment where there's a lot of Chinese students.
Yeah.
And now I'm really appreciating the fact that there is this international environment in a university environment, and I get to bond with Chinese people. I make a bit more effort to, finding that part of my heritage a bit more, and also using that as an opportunity to show them what it's like to be a second generation immigrant, and having a very different outlook on life when you're raised in a country where you're a minority compared to being Chinese and maybe raised in Hong Kong or China where you're not the minority, and so you go for a different experience. And that's always an interesting exchange to have whenever I get a chance to have that exchange. But in terms of being strange or difficult, I think at the time I just kind of wasn't really bothered by it. I very much just latched onto my Britishness, and I wasn't really worried about not having that connection at the time because I was so. I guess the word is sort of it's the consequence of assimilation at the time, right? you latch to your Britishness, that's what you've latched onto, that's what you're comfortable with, and you just stick with that. And you're not really worried about anything else on the other side.
I'm going to ask a probing question, if you don't mind, and it's just with regards, to that idea of the assimilation, and that becoming natural to us. We become almost like naturalized to the environment which we're in. But then, is there still a longing for what kind of like your ancestors had, as it were? So understanding what it was that they have that you're missing, or the other, I'm not sure if I've phrased this right, but that connection, I suppose, with kind of like your ancestors. Is there I suppose all of us want to have an idea of what it was in our past that has helped us to get to where we are now. So did you ever go looking for that, and have you found that, if that makes sense?
I didn't go for looking for it when I was a kid. I have
Right.
now. I think what it is that when you're younger, you essentially just want to latch on to the largest group of people because you find safety and security in that.
Right.
For me, the largest group of people was people who didn't look like me.
Yeah.
And we just bonded on other things, be it music or art or food or whatever. And you do that almost out of survival, because you feel like you have to bond to the largest group possible in order to fit in so that I can, get on and progress. And also my parents' approach was very much, just fit in, don't worry about being, just try and fit in, don't worry about you being different or anything, just get your education, because then your education will not make you different. You'll be successful with your education, get a good degree, you'll fit in because you'll be judged. It's very meritocracy type, approach, right? It doesn't matter that you look different. If you get a good degree, then you'll be fine, and you'll be amongst people who, if you're successful, they're successful, that's all that matters. Yeah. But actually, when you get older, you realize meritocracy doesn't work. And there will be people who will still make out that you're different. And that's when you start realizing that actually that side of you that you've kind of abandoned in order to fit in, that's the side that you should have valued a bit more. And that's when that's when I start looking into like my heritage and valuing it a lot more than I did when I was a kid.
Okay.
So can you realize it wasn't worth abandoning that side of you that is so rich and so valuable, really, to your identity. So yeah.
Could you give us an illustration of something that you went, why it was and what it was that you found when you went looking for it, that you now hold and cherish, having now understood it a little bit more, if that makes sense? Have you got any examples of, you said that you never necessarily valued it as a kid, which I can clearly understand that, but now that you're more mature, that there's things which you kind of like have encountered. Have you got any illustrations or anything which you could give us as an example of that?
Of something that I've encountered that makes me value my heritage a bit more? I don't know. I think what made me really value my identity in terms of being someone who's British and someone who's from Chinese background, and being in that middle road where you're Chinese but you're not really part of the Chinese culture, but you're British but you're not really counting, so being that middle road between all these two worlds is finding other people on social media that have the same experience. Like, social media has a lot of bad things, but one of the things that I really value from it is being able to find other people who had the same experience, be it those who are American Chinese or British Chinese, going on social media saying, this is my experience as a kid. This is what it was like to go to school like this. This is what it's like in the workplace, and sort of sitting between these two worlds and what that experience is. And that has really, really helped to validate my experiences and not feel so alone in those experiences, and realize, oh yeah, it's not just me that, did this weird thing. It's not just me that had this reaction when I was at university and all these international Chinese students were here and I didn't feel like I fit in. So yeah, I think that's my biggest thing, going on social media and finding all these people and seeing all their stories and being like, this validates my experience. I'm not the only one. And embracing that identity of being in between two worlds.
I totally understand. I think I understand that in terms of being able to say, actually, I'm now comfortable in the fact that I'm not necessarily British, I'm not necessarily Chinese, I am who I am. And there's other people who validate our position, our identity, because we've got our shared experience because we are here, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the trajectory, just because we may look the same as somebody else, their lived experience is totally different to my lived experience, but be accepting of that lived experience. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is the lived experience and not just judging people based on how they look, but go through the nuances of, you know, what experiences they've had.
No, that's really fascinating. So what was it that got you interested in your field of study that you're currently doing? And do you feel that you belong within that field of study?
Well, I focus on women's health. So yeah, I would say I do. Why I got into the field of study that I did, I don't know. For some reason, reproductive. I remember these Professor Robert Winston documentaries that were on BBC, where he did a lot of reproductive biology documentaries that I remember watching when I was like 11 or 12 and find them really fascinating. But I found them interesting. It wasn't as if I decided there and then I'm going to be, you know, a reproductive biologist. It wasn't. I just found it very interesting. I was more approaching science on a broad level. I remember at college, it was going to be a decision between either doing a science degree or an English degree, because my A-levels were biology, chemistry, and English.
Right.
I also did half an A-level politics and general studies, but my main subjects were English, biology, and chemistry. And, you know, it turned out biology, chemistry was the one I gravitated more towards to. And again, it was more, I want to latch onto that element of play and being in the lab and doing experiments. So it was a very broad approach. And because I wanted to keep it broad, when I went to university, I picked biochemistry because I felt like it was in between the two. I didn't really fixate on, at that point, I didn't really fixate on doing reproductive biology, even though the lectures in biochemistry were, the reproductive biology lecturers are the ones that always sort of, you know, got me interested the most. But even then I kept everything quite broad. It was just a case of, and again, PhD wasn't in reproductive biology. It was something very broad, like calcium signaling. I didn't really get into specifically women's health and parturition research, studying, you know, how the myometrium, which is the muscle of the uterus, how that contracts and what the consequences of that for women in labor and specifically in preterm labor. I didn't really get down that route until I just happened to find the right job at the right time in my life, which was just after my PhD. And was lucky to get into a subject that I just naturally found very interesting. I didn't feel like I wanted to really fixate and put all my eggs in one basket. It's always that, you know, idea of, you know, growing up, being from a minority background and being Chinese and being, you know, all those elements, you kind of learn just because you want one particular thing doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get it, and you should always have backup plans. So I always kept everything very broad. I remember my Viva actually. At the end of my Viva, one of my assessors said to me, "So what are you going to do now after you've finished your PhD?" And I remember my response was, "Well, you know, I'm just going to try a few postdocs here and there and try some different areas of expertise and see, you know, what I get into." And he said very firmly to me, he said, "No, pick a subject, specialize in it, be good at it, and be an expert in it." And at the time, I didn't quite understand that. I was like, okay, fine. But I now kind of really understand it. You know, it's this idea of don't be a jack of all trades and be an expert at something, because then, you know, you'll be taken seriously then. So,
it's interesting that you went down that route, because the question I was leading up to was to find out where you want to go now in your career endeavors. So is this the field where you want to specialize and continue in, or are there other areas of interest? And how would you try to get there?
Good question. I think most of us in academia know that's we all want to stay in the subject that we feel the most passionate about. And this is the field of research that I want to stay in. Whether or not that's going to happen, that's very much down to, can I get the funding for it? Can I get the support for it? And this, that, and you hear stories of a lot of academics having to leave their field of research because there's no means to support them. Women's health is not particularly an area of research that gets a lot of support. And so it's tricky, but it is the field of research that I care the most about and I want to stick with and I want to become an expert in. So yeah.
That's excellent. That really is. It's really insightful. I remember when we were having our discussion during the week and we were speaking about the kind of like the model immigrant and also the bamboo ceiling, which you highlighted to me. Do you think that we can break through that bamboo ceiling?
There needs to be a change in culture.
Okay.
There needs to be a change in culture, and there needs to be a change in perception of people like myself when it comes to our capabilities of being leaders, our capabilities of being assertive and expert, and being, not always being there to assist, but being there to lead. Those attitudes towards people like myself need to change in order for us to break through the bamboo ceiling. Otherwise, no, and you're just going to get good people leave areas like academia if that bamboo ceiling continues to be there and continues to be a barrier for us to move up and progress in our careers.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I'm going to open up questions. I'm just looking at the time and I see that it's just gone 1 o'clock. I'm going to open up to see if there's anyone who's with us this afternoon who would like to ask a question. I've seen in the chat that there's been some comments, and I was just wondering if there was anyone who wanted to ask another question. There is one, Moon Lee. Did you want to ask your question?
Hello. Oh shit. I don't know where I am. Where am I?
You need to rotate your camera, Millie.
Can you edit this out, like?
Moon Lee, I can barely hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Just about.
Okay. I'm just gonna turn off my camera and just because otherwise my face will be too close and it's not a nice shot. Thanks for sharing your story, Pei. And I think like a lot of second and third generation British Chinese, or well, in my case, I'm not British Chinese, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Chinese.
You're almost there.
Almost there. I got a British citizenship, so. And it's a story that we can really relate, and it's not very much spoken of, like the illusion of, you've got your migrant parents, the first generation, and they bring this idealized version of like China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Taiwan. And you're kind of like stuck in between because it's like you kind of get pressure from the parents of like, no, you should do this because it's cultural and it's traditional,
Yeah.
And it's like very hard to navigate between two worlds at the same time. So really thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And we really need to rethink about reshaping British Chinese identity to have a step away from mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, because they're not the only authorities to shape that. And when you said about, the Britishness, how you latching on, because you are British Chinese,
Yeah.
And I wonder how you make sense of how the same concept, the same sense of Britishness at the same time push you out, because, because there are, you know, including of like some, you know, sad racist right wing bits, not very, yeah, there's a lot of work to do. So I wonder how you make sense of, you know, you are British, but then there's also not a place for you as well.
I think you just kind of have to create a place for yourself. Like there isn't a box that other people create. So you just end up having to create that box for yourself and be comfortable with it. And my mindset is I'm comfortable with who I am. I am in between these worlds and I fit in this, it's like a Venn diagram, right? I'm just in the middle of this Venn diagram almost. And I'm comfortable with that. And if other people have an issue with it, that's their problem and not mine. You know, when you're younger and you're more naive and you're trying to please everybody a bit while you're trying to find your identity, it's very much okay, they find it as a problem, so that it must be a problem. But when you're older and you realize how systems work, you realize actually that it's not my problem, it's their problem. You know, I'm not going to make this my problem. I am who I am. They have an issue, that's their problem. I'm not going to change myself to fit that because that's not comfortable for me. I need to be comfortable with myself. So yeah.
Right. So kind of like following up from Moon Lee's question, thank you, Moon Lee, for that question. In terms of the dichotomy between latching onto the British, or kind of like a British identity, because effectively that's where we've grown, but at the same time having elements of that British or the British society saying you don't belong.
Yeah.
So how to marry up or how to reconcile those two conflicting but similar aspects.
Yeah.
You know, I've just seen another question in the chat, or a point in the chat, which was the idea, because earlier on you mentioned about meritocracy or being meritocratic and where it leads, and that many of our parents and immigrant parents would come over saying, well, just do your best, do your best.
Yeah,
because they believed that by doing their best they would be accepted and looked on as equal. Yeah. Whereas having done our best, it doesn't seem to have been good enough. It never seems to be good enough. How do you reconcile that, and what do you do to kind of like keep yourself sane, as it were, having been told do your best and yet your best doesn't seem to be good enough?
I think the idea of the interpretation of best is subjective.
Right.
I think in order to keep sane, you just need to not compare yourself to other people who didn't come from the same background as you. This is an issue of academia, right? We're constantly compared to each other based on the endpoints. And I don't think there's enough value being placed on what people had to do to get to those endpoints. You know, it's the idea of sort of when you're told to throw a ball over the cliff, some people have more of a gap to throw the ball over than others. But how places that academia work is they only just count how many balls are on the other side and what kind of those balls are, and not really measure the gap that people had to throw the ball over. And when you realize that, you have to stop comparing yourself to other people who had a smaller gap to jump over than you. And then from there, you then realize, actually, what I've done is good enough, you know, and you just got to find a space for other people to see that. And that will be the space that you belong in, not the space where people are constantly telling you you're not good enough because the ball didn't get to the other side. We didn't see your ball on the other side. And, you know, they didn't measure the gap that I had to throw the ball over. So, yeah.
So it's almost like holding on to your own metrics, knowing where you've come from, knowing what you've had to, and having that inner self-belief, that inner resilience to say, you know, I know what I've done is as good, if not better than somebody else's, but at the same time, not diminishing somebody else's contribution. Yeah. Keeping it real.
Yeah, exactly.
It's been really good talking to you. What have you got planned for the Lunar New Year, the New Year celebrations?
So usually my mum still lives in Birmingham, and usually I don't get a chance to go home to Birmingham anymore now. I have to be in London because, you know, it's not a British holiday. I can't.
Yeah, yeah.
She's not going to leave. So this year it's been really good. I have a nice group of, I think they're mostly PhD students, ex-PhD students and ex-colleagues and stuff that were sort of coming together and going out for hot pot next Monday for New Year's Eve. So we're going to do that. I have 2 PhD students who are Chinese, and, you know, I think they're also going to be away from their parents and extended family. So when that happens, we try and come together and just have dinner together when we're away from our immediate family members, just so, you know, we have that, we get to celebrate in some form of way in a large group, which is always a nice vibe. So yeah, that's what we're going to do on Monday. And then for the rest of the week, it's because it's not like a national holiday. I mean, and I'm away from home. I don't tend to make a big deal out of it.
Right. Okay.
But I will come home on New Year's and say Happy New Year. So that's
fantastic.
The matters.
Have you got your little red letter? Is it not the red parcel?
Yeah, the red letter for the lady.
Yeah.
I don't get them anymore. So I'm not a kid anymore. Although I am still single. So technically, if you're a person that don't have any kids, you still get to have the red letters. I don't get any more. My uncle used to get me red letters, and also all like family, friends and stuff. But not so much anymore because I earn my own money, so I don't get the red letters. But I probably will like give my nephews red letters of some sort, although probably won't be on New Year's Day. I always just give them some kind of money on their birthdays or Christmas. So I'll probably add on to that.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. Pei, it's been really great having this conversation with you. I'm going to ask one final question, and it's a question about what advice would you have given to your 16 or your younger self about what you would do, where you would go, kind of thing? What advice would you give them?
I would say beware of the meritocracy, and be very conscious that it's not just about working hard, it's about the people you know and your network. Focus on building your network and making strong friendships. I would say, I remember that was actually a piece of advice that my brother gave me once while I was doing my PhD. I remember we were in the car once and we were driving somewhere around Birmingham. He was asking me how my PhD was doing. I said, oh yeah, I'm like working really long hours and stuff in the lab. But this, that, and next thing he turned around to me and said, you know, you need to not just work hard, you know, you need to be able to, you know, have a network and, you know, make some friends, and because those are the people that are going to really determine how your life goes. And I don't think I really paid attention to that enough when I was younger in my early 20s, but I kind of see the value in it now. So yeah, that's probably the piece of advice I would give to myself earlier.
Brilliant. That's a sage advice, that is. It's not just, it's your network is your net worth. So I totally agree with that. Pei, it's been fantastic having you here. And I want to wish you a happy new year for next week, and all of the community that they also have a really good new year. I don't see why we can't have another national holiday, but never mind. It would be really good. But what I was going to just do is just say another big thank you and let people know what's going to be happening for next week. So Pei, really a big thank you for sharing your belonging with us today. Next week we're going to have Izhar Shah, who is a research associate in environmental engineering at Imperial College, and he's going to be sharing his experiences with us next week. And if you have missed any of the Belonging series, you can see them on our YouTube site, and you can go to tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO. And as I said earlier on, I just want to wish everyone a really good weekend, but it's a New Year weekend, as it were, almost. So enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you again next week. So thanks very much everyone for coming.